Hello and welcome to another episode of the Empowering Leaders podcast. At a Leader, we are passionate about inspiring connections and creating a world of collaboration. Our signature program, A Leader Connect, curates groups of 5 to 6 leaders from diverse backgrounds in sport, industry, social venture and the arts who come together to learn, to connect and to collaborate.
It's been amazing. Here you are on this Zoom call, feeling within the first session like you intimately know these people and care for them. And then all of a sudden realising that even though you're in totally different industries, we're all going through the same thing, or we've been through it and we can help each other, or there's just this hurdle that you can't see past, and then you share it with the group and there's 5 answers in 40 minutes and you think, I have not slept for 2 weeks thinking about that. Like, how is this possible?
So you're listening to stories and the breadcrumbs of what makes success, and I constantly get something out of these Zoom calls and catch-ups because we're all living the same stuff, aren't we?
Extraordinary people with extraordinary experience. What happens there is magical.
The Empowering Leaders podcast is proudly brought to you by Victoria University, where cutting-edge sports and exercise science facilities like heat chambers, performance labs, and altitude environments mean VU is ranked 7th in the world for sports science. VU, uniquely you. As always, a big thank you to Jason Nicholas and his team at Temper Bedding, a mattress like no other. If you enjoy listening to the Empowering Leaders podcast, be sure to subscribe, and please, if you have a moment, we would love you to leave a review so we can reach more listeners and empower more leaders. Today we are joined by someone whose style of leadership has shaped a nation and inspired the world. Former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Jacinda made history as one of the youngest female heads of government who changed the global conversation about what leadership can look like, demonstrating great empathy and strength in her time as Prime Minister. In her 5 years leading New Zealand, Jacinda guided her country through some of its darkest moments, and her award-winning documentary Prime Minister gives a powerful look behind the scenes at her time in office. From the Christchurch terrorist attacks and the White Island eruption to the global pandemic that followed, the film captures some of the moments that defined her leadership, including changing gun laws almost overnight after the Christchurch shooting. Despite the sheer scale of what her country faced, Jacinda led through with grace, courage, and conviction. Since leaving office, Jacinda has continued to lead, serving as New Zealand's special envoy for the Christchurch call, tackling the global issue of violent extremism online, and sits on the board of Prince William's Earthshot Prize, helping to drive environmental innovation around the world. She is also a fellow at Harvard University, where she's focusing on leadership, technology, and the health of democracy. You became Prime Minister at just 37 years of age, and you're leading a nation through what turns out to be these extraordinary times. When you look back now, you were pregnant, a fairly reluctant Prime Minister, it has to be said, and can you ask the qualities you found within yourself to lead your country at such a young age with all that going on?
Do you know, there are moments when I sit and reflect a little bit, as I did after watching the film or during the writing process. There are moments where you think, oh, how did I get through that? But I often talk about the fact that, particularly for those of us who might suffer from a confidence gap or from what we commonly refer to as imposter syndrome, who may self-exclude from moments because we think we don't have the wherewithal to endure them. But I absolutely believe that you do not know what you're capable of until you're doing it. And it just so happens that I found myself in a number of circumstances that I wouldn't necessarily have chosen to be in. But once I was there, certainly was able to, I'd like to think, not just survive, but to navigate those moments. And I'm not unusual in that. Many of us can, if we allow ourselves to be in those positions.
And Jacinda, you often spoke about the ability to be strong and kind, and the documentary is brilliant. I loved it. I recommend everyone has a look at it and gets to know Jacinda at a deeper level. And we saw your strength and your kindness play out a lot. Looking back on your time as Prime Minister, what makes you the most proud about your leadership at that time?
I think at the time I thought so much about what it is we were going to do. And I think that's, understandable. When you're in politics, you have a platform, there's a number of, things that bring you into the position of wanting to govern. You have your manifesto. So you're very much fixated on the policy side, the list of things. What I underestimated was just how important it would become to me that the way we did things mattered. Now, at a personal level, I knew that I never wanted, when I was in politics, to sacrifice who I was. I wanted to be able to be myself. I wanted to bring to bear the values that were important to me. But I think I underestimated that could be a source of disruption in some ways. Lots of discussion, I think, for good reason, about the fact that, we don't always have equal amounts of representation in things like politics. So often there's that focus on, were you leading as a woman differently than others might? But actually, I was a third female Prime Minister in New Zealand. I was not carving a new path for my agenda. However, I did talk openly about kindness in politics. I talked about empathy and compassion. And it's not that those things have been absent before, but I wanted to amplify them. And I hope that as a consequence, we can have a conversation about, just because those haven't often been talked about values in politics does not mean there's not a place for them. In fact, in these times, I think now more than ever, we should be seeking those values in public life.
You were the second ever sitting Prime Minister to give birth while in the chair, and Neve was born only a couple of months into...
Not literally in the chair.
That would have been an interesting part of the documentary had you gone there.
It would have had some drama.
Being a mother and a global leader at the same time, how did that shape you as a leader, and how did you balance that through those times?
Oh, no question. I mean, I think obviously I've got no other experience to compare it to. I only know what it is to lead and be a mum. I think, though, at a practical level, even before I had my daughter, I was very focused on child well-being. I knew that I wanted to put that at the centre of the work we were doing. That always felt important to me. But there's no question that being a mum while in office had an effect. It made me very mindful about the choices that particularly women, but primary caregivers sometimes did and didn't have, and I wanted them to have more choices. I didn't want the idea that you should feel like you have to be in work or feel like you have to be at home. I think, a lot of what we did was focused on how do we give people the financial security to make those choices for themselves that are best for them and suit them and their needs. So things like extending paid parental leave, making a universal family tax credit for the first year of a child's life, increasing the value of our sole parent payments, all came from that reinforcement of that belief. But I also really started thinking about people who raise children on their own. I was so lucky to have a village that I thought a lot about people who might not have a village. And that, was one of the final things I remember doing before leaving office was increasing the childcare subsidy so that it would reach almost every sole parent in New Zealand.
You achieved a lot in a short space of time, and the legislation, you decriminalised abortion almost immediately in office, and your leadership and New Zealand story inspired a lot of people globally. What advice would you give to young people, especially young women who might be stepping into a leadership role for the first time?
Well, first of all, I'd tell them to do it. And sometimes it surprises people. I think they look at what may appear to be a pretty tumultuous time in office and think, that was rough. And there's a lot of focus on the pitfalls of leadership, how it is a very difficult place to be. We don't often talk about the joy. We don't talk about the privilege, and how humbling it can be. What other job could you have where you might wake up one morning and hear a news clip about someone doing something, amazing and innovative in the environmental space, for instance, and think, I'd like to meet that person. And you can. And not only can you meet that person, they can share with you what was great about their experience, what was hard, and then you can go and fix that so that there'll be more people like them. It's an incredibly humbling and privileged job. And I would say to anyone, yes, there are downsides. Yes, there are difficult parts, but there are great parts as well. The second thing I would say is just the thing that I mentioned at the beginning. You don't know what you're capable of until you're doing it. So if you have some self-doubt, great. That means you have humility, and that's exactly who we need in office right now.
Yeah, well said. How do you hope people remember your time as Prime Minister, not necessarily in terms of the policy, but just the tone for leadership that you set across that time?
Yeah, and that's that idea again of it's not just what you do, it's how you do it. I used to think that actually the legacy you left was never necessarily your name. I mean, certainly when you're in New Zealand politics, we're a small country. We don't expect to leave a mark as individuals. You hope that you continue and hold on to the reputation our country has that we value so highly, and you hope that people will hang on to the policies because they value them themselves. But you're not so high and mighty to think that somehow you personally and your name will live on. And so I had that in my mind as well. But if alongside a bunch of ideas and policies that made a difference in people's lives, they can also say, and you can be kind in politics, and you can be an empathetic leader, and you can be sensitive. You can be someone who worries. You can be those things and be at the highest level. That is a legacy I would be very proud to leave. That will only be reinforced for me if I'm not the only one.
Yeah, the people that influenced your leadership style, Jacinda, I'm interested in. Was there a few people that shaped that kindness, that empathy, that ability to see things the way you did? And how about now influencing the next generation of leaders? How do you feel about that?
Oh, undoubtedly, my parents. Yeah, it's really interesting when you're in politics, people immediately make the assumption that all of your role models will come from politics. And look, no question, absolutely, people in politics will shape you. The first politician I ever got to vote for to be Prime Minister was Helen Clark. And how lucky was I that I grew up with strong female leadership, didn't question that my gender would stand in the way of being in politics. I mean, that's something I don't take for granted. But I think for me, I think because leadership for me was never going to be a separation between the private and the public. It was always going to be those people that I saw in the round, that I lived with day to day, that I saw during good times and bad times that would have the biggest influence of me, and they were my mum and dad. My mum's a very generous, kind-hearted person. There's nothing she wouldn't do for someone else. So much of her life has been dictated by how she can be in the service of others. So I think, definitely so much of who I am has come from her. My father, I realized when writing about some of my early years, he was really the first person I ever saw up close who held power. He was a policeman. All my early years, for 40 years. And we lived in a very small town when I was younger. And so I had close proximity to him policing. And the way that he did it was, I would describe as thoughtful. He didn't view the world in a black and white way, didn't lord his power over others. He was a community policeman. And I think that was probably more influential than I probably gave credit to until I sat and thought and wrote about it.
What amazing influences to have. And I love it when people reference the luckiness of having a mother and father that have those sort of qualities. For them, seeing their daughter go through these tumultuous times, and as you said, New Zealand's a small place. You bump into Jacinda Ardern lovers and people who maybe vote for the opposite party. How did they cope with that?
Oh, yeah. I don't know that it was easy. I mean, I wouldn't want to speak for them because I know they're very proud of me. But my dad, who was a aggressive consumer of news. I grew up with him reading the newspaper every day after work. 6 o'clock, the news would be on. He was a lover of history and current affairs, but for 5 years he didn't watch the news. So I think it was hard on them, as it would be anyone seeing a loved one, under the spotlight and facing public scrutiny constantly. But as hard as it was, I know they were and still are proud of me.
And Jacinda, they saw you lead under what turned out to be three defining crises that you know well, the horrific Christchurch attacks, and your leadership there was extraordinary, the White Island eruption and the disaster following that, and then clearly the pandemic. What did you learn about yourself and leading under pressure in those extraordinary times?
It's really interesting, and I talk openly about the idea of imposter syndrome. And I think there's probably a bit of a blanket view that if you have self-doubt, that's something that plagues you through every moment and every difficulty that you might face. But actually, not my experience. Actually, in crisis in particular, that is a period in time where there is no room for anything other than focusing on the issue at hand, on putting at the centre those who are most gravely affected, consuming every piece of information that you can, if it requires it, leaning into the expertise and advice of others, and all of that makes you incredibly decisive. And so this idea, I think, that when we think about empathetic leadership in particular, somehow it has this connotation to it that you're perhaps less able to make clear-minded decisions, that you're flighty almost. But my experience is the opposite. You are so focused on making the right decisions on behalf of others that you become very clear-eyed about the direction of travel and what needs to be done, very focused. And in crisis, I think that's amplified. I think one of the things you risk is that it becomes all-consuming. So sometimes you may not prioritize self-care or basics like sleep. But it was one of my learnings through crisis. It is wrong to assume that if you ever have some self-doubt, that means that you're unable to leave with clarity and direction. In fact, there'll be more of that, I think, in those moments rather than less.
We all are born different. As we grow, the experiences we have develop into outlooks uniquely our own, charting our life's course. No one sees an idea, opinion, or opportunity like you. And no one sees you like VU. Victoria University. Uniquely you.
At Alida, our signature program, Alida Connect, is something we're really passionate and proud of. We bring together groups of 5 to 6 people around the globe from diverse backgrounds, sport, industry, social venture and the arts. We come together to learn, to connect and to collaborate.
The thing that I've loved about it is not just the meetings that we have with our group, it's the thinking that you do for days and days afterwards. Someone says something and it sparks a thought, and I found that I would go back and look at things that I was doing in a different light. Within my sport and within women's sport, I'm just someone who I try to lead by keeping people talking about the issues. There's times when I think the person I'm trying to convince is not listening to me. It actually got me thinking about, okay, this is how I need to address my communication with them. So it was so valuable, and the little group that we've got is great, and I'm really looking forward to sort of continuing to connect with them into the future because we're all so very different. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it.
The documentary shows how clear and decisive you were, and I think it's impossible to walk in your shoes as the Prime Minister of a country like New Zealand in the COVID era. And then, the lockdowns and the mandates put you in this extraordinary position of authority. And I wonder, how did you sort of balance maintaining that public trust and still respecting individuals' freedom at the same time with these unprecedented measures that you took?
Yeah, a great question. And this was always on our minds. And then the interesting thing for me, of course, is with hindsight, we have that debate from one particular angle, whereas at the time, I remember an extraordinary amount of pressure, in part because people saw vaccines as the pathway to freedom. They saw them as the way to get away from having to use what were crude and really difficult public health measures that were obviously used in both New Zealand and Australia. And so they were seen as that ticket to freedom. And so there was a lot of pressure to try and to increase vaccination levels as quickly as possible, maintain people's sense of safety by having others around them who are vaccinated, that I remember one of the things we did was try and actually say, well, actually, these are areas where we won't mandate that workforce. There is no grounds to mandate that workforce. And putting in parameters to say, well, if you're in the private sector, here's a process you should go to justify using them in your workforce. Of course, so at that time, it may have been framed that we were actually putting some limitations. In hindsight, of course, it's framed around, were too many people covered by those? And those are discussions and debates we should be open to having. I think that's probably the takeaway for me, and what I hope even the film, portrays. Decisions are made under the most difficult of circumstances. And even though they may not always be ones that people agree with, I hope that we can agree that the motivation was often the right one. I hope we can agree that saving lives was an important focus to have. But of course, let's debate whether there are ways to do that differently next time.
And there's no doubt that your kindness and willingness and want to try and help people is at the fore. But you mentioned I was living in Melbourne, still am, through what was one of the world's sort of harshest lockdown periods. And Jacinda, there's a statistic that haunts me through that time. At the end of the last lockdown, there were 500 teenage girls a week being diagnosed with an eating disorder in Melbourne, directly linked to the nature of the lockdowns, confining them to their screens. And we've recently had our Chief Health Officer here say that he had no scientific basis for keeping kids out of school for 2 years. And do you think these conversations are important, that we go back and we learn from what some of the effects of those measures that took, especially to young people who were probably at a lower risk than others? Is that a conversation we need to have and maybe aren't having as clearly as we should?
Oh, we should have those conversations. When we were still in office, we instigated our own Royal Commission, the most significant form of inquiry that we can create, because in New Zealand, once you put in a Royal Commission, you hand over to experts to look at the issue. And absolutely, we needed and wanted to do that. No one wants to have a pandemic again. No one wants to live through anything like that again. And I wouldn't wish it on any leader to have to lead through something like that, let alone to anyone to have to live through it. But we have to be prepared. We have a duty of care to go back and look and say, well, if we have another occasion, what should we think about? What are the things that we need to take into account? For my part, I remember having frequent conversations with a pediatrician who had in their mind both the physical but also social impacts of children being out of school, because we were thoughtful about that. We were, even though we had a lot of intergenerational living, and that was one of the things people were worried about, of children, even though it may not be as unsafe for them, what if they're bringing it back to their households? But in the end, we did have, you compare New Zealand, for instance, the likes of the UK, we did not have lose as much school time and interface as some other countries. That doesn't mean it was easy for anyone, but we must learn.
You mentioned, Jacinda, that you maybe forgo sleep in those moments, and understandably. What have you learnt? We love this idea of self-leadership, that you have to fill your own cup up first. Have you been able to find what works for you so that you can be at your best?
Yeah, I mean, and it's some of I have a fellowship now for people who are still in politics who really value empathetic leadership. And we talk a bit about, what does it take to survive in high pressure roles, but not just survive, be a good decision maker, be a good colleague, be a good leader, be a good partner, parent, child. And certainly I know the things that helped me. I wasn't always good at them, but I remember one of the things that was very easy to martyr yourself to was sleep. Almost I found an expectation that when you're in public life or a public service role, there was almost an expectation that you wouldn't sleep much. People would often ask me, how many hours do you get? And I felt that if I gave an answer that was, 7, or that someone might question my dedication and commitment to the job. And so, I didn't sleep as much as I needed to in the early period until I had someone point out to me that actually maybe that was irresponsible. Maybe to do my job well, I needed to prioritize that. And I did notice the cognitive impact of a lack of sleep, the lack of clarity, sometimes that you'd fixate on an issue in a way that wasn't that helpful. You'd lose perspective. So my number one for leaders or people in high pressure roles would be try and prioritize an adequate amount of sleep.
There's the Churchill myth, isn't it, that only slept for 2 hours, and the research will tell you it might be the most horrific thing you can do. And congratulations, the fellowship that you're doing at Harvard, the focus on empathy and empathetic leadership. Can you teach people empathy, Jacinda?
I would like to think that given the degree to which we prioritize this for our own young people and kids, when you think about the things that you day to day will talk about with children, it'll be things like, generosity. You're always trying to teach your kids to share. You're always trying to teach them how to be brave, you can do it, that encouragement, that self-belief. But we do teach our kids empathy. We teach them how to be thoughtful about the thoughts and feelings of others. And so even if it's something that's hard to teach, it's certainly a value we regard highly enough to teach it to our children from a very early age. So all I'm doing is trying to maintain a value that for our kids we teach, but not abandon it for our expectation of leaders. So I operate on the assumption that for the most part, all of us have a sense of empathy. And in fact, in politics, when you work with, as I tend to do, I tend to work with progressives, that for the most part, that's already there. What they need to believe is it's possible to elevate that value and succeed. We're in an environment now where there's a belief that people think that to survive in politics, you have to be a particular way, that you have to be, and that strength is denoted by a series of character traits, arrogance, probably being a bit of a liar, egotistical, that we kind of accept that those are just the traits that are in politics and you won't survive if you don't have them. I think that's wrong. I think it's self-reinforcing. And I think we need to spotlight the people out there who don't operate that way and demonstrate that you can not only survive, you can thrive.
Incredible, worthwhile thing that you're pursuing, chasing more empathy in our leaders. As you said, it's an alarming state of what we see, and you do worry for normalising that for the next generation of young people who feel like that's the path, but you need to...
And it's self-fulfilling, because if that's the nature of it, then people won't go into politics unless that's what they believe politics should be. And so we just need a few more good humans in there. And there are good humans in there. We just need more of them.
We need to tell their stories more, which is why your story is a brilliant one. And congratulations for doing it, and having your husband film it is such a gift to people to see that there is a way to do it. Whether you agree or disagree, at least you can see the empathy and kindness shine through. The distortion of truth, Jacinda, is something I know that you're alarmed about as well. How do we solve it?
It's a great question, and I think that it is, we haven't necessarily, I think at the time when we had this great debate about the role that social media would play as the great democratizer, the ability for people to connect, the ability of politicians to speak directly to constituents. But we didn't probably spend enough time talking about some of the other side of the debate. What if it would be very easy to disseminate disinformation, to manipulate, to distort, to see, vigilantism. And we see the presence of all of this today. And that is having an impact on democracy. And it often gets framed around the idea of free speech. No one here is under, I think for the most part, we have this discussion. No one wants to take away anyone's freedom of speech. But I do think we need to have a discussion around when we see the use of deliberate disinformation, for instance, and the impact that has on the health and well-being of our societies, because we've got enough real-world problems out there now that we need to have the ability to at least agree on the problem so we can have those really important disagreements and debates. No one's seeking a uniformity of view. We just need to be able to build consensus, and we won't do that unless we can agree on the problem in the first place. So the global community, I hope, will come together on some of this, be willing to have this discussion. I see it in some corners, but not others. But until we do, I do fear. I do fear for our ability to solve some really significant problems.
When we have words like alternative facts, we're in a bizarre situation. And again, I think you're right at the cutting edge of wanting to normalise truth and facts and debate from there. Final question, who's been the greatest leader in your life?
So they have to be alive?
No.
Because you will have seen in the film, I've always been oddly drawn to the leadership lessons of an Antarctic explorer of the great, as it was called, heroic age, Ernest Shackleton. And I think it's because the lesson there, he set out with a very particular view of mind, a particular ambition. And when that ambition, what he set out to achieve, when he failed, he very quickly pivoted to actually what was the most important priority of all, which was how do you motivate and keep your team going under the most difficult and extraordinary circumstances. And that, I think, is such a worthwhile and important lesson, that optimism is most important in the darkest and most difficult of times. And far be it for it to be treated as something that you abandoned, lest you be seen as unrealistic and ungrounded, that actually in the darkest times, that's when it's the most important as a leader.
Not surprised that Ernest Shackleton has inspired you the way that remarkable story has, and I suspect if he was around, he'd be inspired by what you've achieved, and the kindness and the empathy and the leadership you're still showing is a great inspiration to many. Congratulations, Prime Minister. The documentary is a great legacy for you, and I encourage everyone to watch it. Nice to meet you. Thanks for your time, Jacinda.
Thank you, Luke. Nice to chat.